In this video, let's learn about optional parameters. So let's go to the previous lecture and copy this root template and paste it over here. So this root template that I just pasted, this is to specify that we have two different root parameters that have default values. Let's say that I want to make the last parameter segment to be optional. Then how do I specify that? I use curly braces. I specify the parameter name and then followed by a question mark. So this makes the root segment here, this root parameter here, optional. This is actually pretty similar to required parameter with default values. In this case, this segment is also optional. You don't have to provide it. However, there's a difference. In this case, if you don't provide it, then there is a default value for the parameter. But for optional parameters, in this case, if you don't provide this optional segment, then the root parameter doesn't get any value, as if the root parameter has never existed. So let me go into Visual Studio and show you exactly what I mean here. So this is the source code that we used in the previous video. Let's say that we keep the categories as default value, we keep the size at default value, but for ID, instead of use a default value, I turn it into an optional parameter. Now I'm going to set a breakpoint over here, and then I'm going to just run. And the default is the home page, right? The page that is just launched right here is the home page, and our breakpoint gets hit. Why our breakpoint gets hit? Because these first two segments get the default value and the last segment isn't actually required. Therefore, the ID root parameter doesn't get any value. So let's actually see what is happening inside the context object. Examine this and go into request, and then let's go into root values. And now you can see that instead of 3, we only have 2 root values, key value pair. So we have category, which is shirts, and we have size, which is media. And now notice that we don't have an ID, right? The ID doesn't have a default value, as if the ID root parameter doesn't actually exist. So this is what happens when you have an optional parameter and we don't specify that optional parameter when sending request, then that optional parameter doesn't exist to the server, right? You can see that in the context object, it doesn't exist. So that's the difference between optional parameter and a required root parameter with default value, right? The required root parameter with default value, when not provided, will always get the default value. Whereas for optional root parameters, if you don't provide the segment, it will behave like it never exists. So that's how it works. That's the difference between the optional root parameters and required root parameter with default values. And this is how you specify it. One thing I also need to emphasize is that optional parameters, just like the root parameters with default values, you have to specify it at the end. You cannot specify it when it's in the middle. So let's actually stop debugging and change the code a little bit, which is actually very similar to what we have gone through in the previous lecture. I just want to show you quickly. Okay, so if I run this, you can see that the category gets the default value, the size doesn't exist, the ID doesn't exist, therefore it's all blank here, right? And if you want to use optional values for size, then you have to make both of these optional. Right? So for example, I say computers here without specifying the rest of the parameters. Then I get the parameters here and size is empty and ID is empty. Actually, they don't exist, right? And if you want to leave out ID, then you have to specify size. Let's say a large computer, right? And then size get large and ID still doesn't exist. And of course, you can specify ID like this and then ID gets 0, okay? But if you don't want to specify the size segment, but want to specify the ID segment, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist. Okay, so if I just delete large, this is not a correct path, and you get HTTP error 404. And if you don't provide any of them, then size doesn't get it, ID doesn't get it either. If you put 0 here, then size will get 0. So this is the same logic as what we mentioned in the previous video. In one word, if you want to use optional parameter, which means you want to leave out that optional segment, then that segment has to be at the end of the path. Or you can leave out multiple segments at the end of the path. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. If any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.